Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Maya Ghosh, and I'm one of your Ath Fellows for the year. The legacy of race has provided unique impacts on historical, social, and economic facets of the American experience. Tonight, we're joined by Glenn Loury, the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University, who will offer insights and reflections for responsible leadership given these enduring themes. He will be in conversation with Michael Fortner, an Associate Professor of Government at CMC. Professor Glenn Loury is a prominent social critic and public intellectual, writing mainly on themes of racial inequality and social policy. He has also published extensively in areas of applied microeconomic theory, game theory, and the economics of race and inequality. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Econometric Society, a member of the American Philosophical Society, and a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Carnegie Scholarship to support his work. Professor Loury is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, is a contributing editor at the Boston Review, and was for many years a contributing editor at the New Republic. A graduate of Northwestern University, where he received his PhD from MIT in 1976. He taught at Northwestern and at the University of Michigan before moving to Harvard. In 1982, at the age of 33, he became the first African-American tenured professor of economics in the history of Harvard University. He has been at Brown since 2005. As one of CMC's 75th anniversary distinguished speakers, Professor Loury will highlight issues in civilization and commerce, one of 3 academic collaboration themes of our special 75th anniversary celebration. Now, before we begin, just a few reminders. Although masking is not required, it is strongly recommended, so you're welcome to do so if you would like. Also, remember that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited, so take a moment right now to put away your cell phones. Remember to be present in the moment. Take out a pen and paper, because at the end we'll have some time for question and answers. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Loury to the Athenaeum.
So before we start, many of you may not know this, but I've been fortunate enough to know Glenn for a number of years now, and I met him at a particularly important part of my life. My book had just come out, and despite what I thought was sort of a lot of wisdom, there were a lot of critics who were uncomfortable with some of the conclusions and findings in the book. But that did not deter Glenn from, one, talking about the book on the show, but also inviting me on and giving me a platform to sort of share my ideas. And I'm not alone, so I want to do tonight what the rappers call giving you your flowers, and thanking you on behalf of a host of young intellectuals and scholars who do not fit a particular ideological mold, and who've been ostracized in various ways because of that, but you intervened in our lives and gave us a platform and a space to do what we want to do and be who we are. So thank you, Glenn, for that.
My pleasure, Michael.
So now, the hard part. Tonight, the theme that was given to me was civilization, commerce, and race. And when I first got the theme, I was, as the young people today say, shook. I was shook because the first thing that came to my mind was that my ancestors were commerce. That they were sold, they were bought, they were traded, and that was part, the interaction of race and commerce, the beginning of the history of this nation. There's been a lot of talk about that founding moment, 1619. I just want to read to you a piece from Nicole Hannah-Jones's sort of lead essay. Anti-Black racism runs in the very DNA of this country, Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his case for reparations. America begins in black plunder and white democracy, two features that are not contradictory, but complementary. Then he reads one of my favorite books, quotes one of my favorite books, American Slavery, American Freedom, by Edmund Morgan. The men who came together to found the independent United States, dedicated to freedom and equality, either held slaves or were willing to join hands with those who did. None of them felt entirely comfortable about the fact, but neither did they feel responsible for it. Most of them had inherited both their slaves and their attachment to freedom from an earlier generation, and they knew the two were not unconnected. So, the first question for you is, how should we understand slavery and its role in our history?
Wow. Well, that's a lot. That's a question for a historian, not for a humble economist like myself. I mean, the first thing that I would say is that if we're going to take on slavery, let's take on slavery. And slavery begins with the capture of the Africans who were enslaved by other Africans in Africa. This is not a so much blame here, so much blame there accountancy. It's just a statement of historical fact. The Europeans did not pull that off all by themselves. So, there's a lot of blame to go around. You say your ancestors. They were only some of your ancestors. They were only some of my ancestors. My name is Loury. I've got Scotch-Irish ancestors. Slavery in the United States, I can't remember the exact quote from Hannah Jones or from Coates. Okay, I mean, these are words. It's a poetic sentence. I'm not going to try to argue the point. I can see why a person might come to say that. But slavery was a commonplace of human culture going back to antiquity. The historical sociologist Orlando Patterson has this big book, 1982, Slavery and Social Death, which is a comprehensive survey of the institution of slavery going back to antiquity, slavery in the Orient, slavery in Africa, slavery in Islam. Slavery was not new, and yes, indeed, the U.S. was founded by slaveholders, and indeed, the U.S. economy through the 19th century was built in part on the commerce that the slaves made possible in cotton and so on. But is that what defines America? I don't think so, actually. I think emancipation comes a lot closer to defining the spirit and the essence of the American experiment than does the fact of slavery. I think the seeds of emancipation were already present in the compromise that the framers entered into in 1787 with the Constitution. I think the Civil War is a watershed event in the history of this republic, which resulted in the emancipation of the slaves, 600,000 dead in a country of 30 million. I think abolition, the movement, and I know it's not only or even mainly an American movement, but the movement, the moral movement abetted by institutions of liberty that have permitted people to assemble and to express their views and ultimately to persuade their fellows. I think that is much more emblematic of or characteristic of the essence of the American experiment than the fact of slavery itself. I think centering slavery does a disservice to the greatness, to the world historic achievement, which was the creation of the United States of America. I disagree with the spirit of the 1619 Project for that reason. So, what was it? Some 4 million enslaved persons were set free in the process of the emancipation and the enactment of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. They weren't made equal citizens at first. No, they were not equal citizens. They were stigmatized, denigrated, marginalized. But in the fullness of time, the population of enslaved persons has given birth to we American Negroes. I'm going to use that word. I know the word is controversial, but I mean it in a specific historical context. I mean, the people who descended from slaves, who are referred to as Black, African American, and so forth in contemporary parlance, but who for much of the post-emancipation history of the country were referred to as the American Negro, capital N. We're the richest, most powerful, freest people in large numbers of African descent on the planet. So this is about narrative, this is about control of historical narrative, and each generation is going to tell the story of the country in its own way. This is a contested narrative. The 1619 Project is a point of view about how to tell the story of the history of the country. It's not one that I would readily adopt, frankly, for the reasons that I've tried to give voice to here.
Why do you think it has been adopted and embraced so widely then?
Well, I think that, I'm just to be honest with you, Michael. You asked me a question. So the civil rights movement, 1945 to 1970, if you like, the Second Reconstruction, it creates an environment in which the continuing marginal status along many dimensions of social well-being of African Americans needs to be rationalized. We have a wealth disparity, well, slavery. We have high or poverty rates, lower educational achievement, lower home ownership, well, slavery and Jim Crow. We have family structure issues. We have behavioral problems in our communities with our young people. Well, we have an achievement gap in the educational sphere. We have prisons overflowing with young Black men, mainly. Well, slavery. Well, racism in the very indeed, anti-Black racism. You have to say anti-Black racism now because this narrative is meant to carve out a kind of exceptionalism for Blacks. And we're confronted now in the 21st century with the country having so rapidly changed in the last 75 years with immigration in large numbers, tens of millions of new Americans coming mostly from non-European points of origin. We have to somehow come to grips here in the 21st century with the continued laggardly status of substantial portions of the African American community. I think the temptation to embrace, therefore, an account of the country and of our place within it, which memorializes and elevates almost to a theological level the injury done to our people, the contempt for the humanity of our people, the hatred of our people. I think the temptation is compelling. I'm not even sure that many of the people who promote it would even be consciously aware of it, but I think the comfort taken in knowing, believing that rather than the country being what I think it objectively is, which is a beacon of freedom and hope to humanity, people from every corner of the globe, of unlimited possibility, where the place of Americans within it, African Americans within it, is on the whole, a very favorable endowment. We've been dealt a good hand here, not a bad hand. Rather than accept that reality, I think people take comfort in a different account. I think it's a pity, really. I think it's a pity both because it does not do justice to what's been achieved over the last nearly 3 centuries here on the North American continent, the creation of the United States of America, and with all its warts. And also because it teaches our young children, our young African American children, what does Ta-Nehisi Coates say in his book? He says, don't drink the Kool-Aid, don't believe the hype. F the American dream. You must be kidding me. The American dream, he sneers, so to speak. That's what we're going to teach our children about this great country, where they are birthright citizens, that they're forever with their nose pressed against the candy store window, that they're forever on the outs, that they're forever marginalized.
But it's not just slavery, of course. It's Jim Crow, it's redlining, it's racial inequities in the administration of the New Deal, it's disinvestment of American cities at the point at which sort of black power is erupting. And just some statistics from a paper that you wrote that I love, the median net worth for whites in 2014 was $144,000. The median net worth for blacks in 2014 was $11,000. Home ownership for whites, 72%. Home ownership for blacks, 43%. And we can go on and on and on. We talk about incarceration rates. You know, Michelle Alexander talks about the new Jim Crow. So it's not just that we had slavery, but we had these sort of new systems and institutions after slavery that seem to account for the disparities that we witness in the data when it comes to home ownership, when it comes to net worth. How should we understand those disparities, if not those sort of historical developments?
Oh, well, here we are, aren't we? So who am I going to blame? How are we going to understand these disparities? Now, if I said that parents need to raise their kids, okay? If I said that the behavior, the violent behavior, the predatory criminal behavior of large numbers of black people walking around in American cities was substantially responsible for the large numbers who are incarcerated. If I said, the streets are paved with gold in this country, what are you talking about? Will you look at what one wave after another of immigrants have been able to accomplish? If I were to say, have you heard of affirmative action? By which I mean the industrial strength efforts to make amends in one form or another by special dispensation offered to African Americans in one elite venue after another. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's the language of the day, et cetera, et cetera. If I said, whoever said every group was going to come out equal in everything that people do? Have you heard about the Jews? They got a lot of wealth. What about the Asians? How much educational achievement have they got, et cetera? So why is it that an outcome that is disfavorable to African Americans is ipso facto an indictment of the society when the society is as diverse, as dynamic, as prosperous, and as full of opportunity as it is? And where in this accountancy of responsibility is the ball in our court? When are we going to be responsible for how we raise our children and what we do with the opportunities that are in front of us? So here's my bottom line. We can lose ourselves in this pipe dream narrative if we want to, but the 21st century is not going to wait for anybody. While we are going around with our hand out talking about what was done to our ancestors, people are busy building businesses, building their families, building their homes, and creating their lives. They're not going to stand still for us. What do you want in 2050? Black people being a third of us, 40% of us being wards of the state, having to be dealt with through a special dispensation because of something that was done 200 years before to our ancestors? When are we going to say it's time to man up and woman up to the realities of life? No one said life was fair. There's no guarantee anywhere that life is fair. It is what it is, and we better get busy making the best of it right now. Now, let me just say this. That's not a political speech that I would give. I'm saying that here because I've been asked the question by my friend who was so generous in his introduction. I feel like I owe him an answer. I wouldn't run for Congress on that speech. But I damn sure run my family on that speech. That's what I tell my kids.
Yes, but you would not deny the history of discrimination in labor markets. You would not deny redlining. You would not deny that there have been systems that have created a situation that would make it harder for African Americans to enjoy the fruits of the American dream. And if you would not deny that, wouldn't that suggest some type of remedy that attends to those dynamics?
No, I wouldn't deny it because, as I said, life is not fair. And in the case of African Americans, within the American context, life has been particularly unfair at many junctures. And those things that you pointed to are a part of it. They're not the only thing that you could say. They are a part of it. But I want to know what the program is. So I have my program. My program is get busy. Let's seize the opportunities that exist. They are plentiful. Let's stop belly aching and man and woman up. That's my argument. Let's man and woman up. That's what I'm going to say to my kids. It's not the political speech that I would give, but that's what I would say to my kids. Let's get busy. I want to know what the other argument is. What is the other argument? Reparations?
We'll get there. We'll get there.
I mean, you really want to put yourselves in the hands of the systemically racist, black-hating majority of this country? You want to throw yourself on the mercy of a court which you have already declared to be intrinsically biased and hating of your very humanity? That's your plan?
So we have the young generation is much more critical of capitalism. There's a constant critique of neoliberalism, free market ideas. And so the question for you is that what you just said, I think, presupposes that capitalism could work for black folk. Do you believe that there's space in capitalism in America for black progress?
Oh, yes. I mean, with great respect, my brother. I mean, I think the question is absurd. Compared to what? I mean, has anybody been paying attention to what's happened in world economic history in the last 75 years? I mean, compared to what? What were you going to do? Seize the means of production and socialize the... Capitalism is the foundation of our prosperity. I am not talking about an unregulated, Wild West cowboy capitalism where anything goes and you know, we shut down the Federal Trade Commission, or we don't have a welfare state, or we have tax rates of 0. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm fine with a social safety net, with a welfare state, with a sensible set of structures to try to take care of our fellow citizens and whatnot. But the idea that markets are the enemy, I'm talking about prices. I'm talking about allocating resources based upon people seeing price signals and knowing what the relative returns and costs are to the alternative activities that they can pursue. The idea that profit is the enemy, that corporations, greed of corporations, this is sophomoric rhetoric, in my opinion, not to be taken seriously.
But you do believe in government intervention in terms of the social safety net. You did say that. So
No,
right.
you said capitalism.
Right.
I'm comparing what's the opposite of capitalism. It's socialism. Let's be real. I'm not saying don't have a state that tries to take care of people, that ensures that people have health care, that feeds the hungry and houses the ill-housed and stuff like that. Those are debates that we can have around the margins about how much and how little and when and where and how. I'm talking about a free enterprise economy where the major decisions about resource allocation are driven by people's calculation about what's in their interest, their private interest. I'm talking about private property. I'm talking about not politicians deciding on where plants get built and what industries get fostered and so on, but investors directing their capital this way or that through a market of finance that is mediating between investors and those who are going to use capital. I'm talking about not having prices under the dictate and the control of commissars, but having them set by the free interplay of supply and demand. That's what I'm talking about. And what I'm saying is, if we look at world history where that general system of economic management has been abandoned, poverty has ensued, starvation has ensued. That's not any way to run an economy. If you're serious, just ask the Chinese.
So do you believe, since your formulation does allow for the government to sort of intervene, do you believe it should intervene on racial questions as well?
What do you mean?
What I mean is that before you were talking about how we shouldn't rely on sort of the state to save us, because it's not going to save us. And so I wonder, since you do have a sense that the state can serve a positive role for the poor or the working class, why couldn't the state sort of intervene on these racial questions and produce a sort of a positive result as well?
Okay, yeah, I do want to be clear, because the first part of the conversation was about what to do about persisting racial inequality. Here we are, we have disparities by race. What are we supposed to do about it? And I was saying, reading the history of the country primarily through a lens of slavery, I thought was missing the boat in terms of what the country is really about. And I was saying I wanted to put a lot of responsibility on the onus of we black people ourselves to take advantage of the opportunities that exist, imperfect such as they are, and to man up and woman up, as I put it. I was saying that about that. Then you asked me about capitalism, and I was saying it's okay by me, subject to various restraints and regulation, but it's basically the way I'd want to order an economy in order to ensure the prosperity of all of our people. So I'm not against capitalism, and I basically, this is not a anti-black, racist state. It's an imperfect, but moving toward more nearly perfect, as Obama would have put it, arrangement. Now you're asking me what to do about whether I want the state to be involved in the mitigation of the historical overhang of anti-black racism. And I guess it depends on what we're talking about. Now, if we're talking about anti-discrimination laws, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and various extensions thereof, in which the state attempts to regulate commercial transactions so as to ensure that they're non-discriminatory and ensure fair housing opportunities so as to ensure they're non-discriminatory and so forth. I'm all for that. I mean, there were people who opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 when it was in the legislature coming through on some kind of libertarian grounds. You don't tell me who to hire, don't tell me who to rent my place to. I wouldn't, that's not an argument that you would hear me making. So if it's try to make it a level playing field in the economy on behalf of a racial justice imperative, that would be one thing, and I'd be okay with that, more than okay with that. If it's racial discrimination in favor of African Americans, and we can talk more specifically about affirmative action policies. It's not just higher education, it's a lot of stuff. It's credit markets, it's procurement by governments and so forth. It's hiring of public employees and so forth, where a government thumb on the scale in favor of African Americans in an effort to mitigate the consequences of historical discrimination. I think that's much more problematic, and we can talk about that. And if you're talking about scale effort on the part, I assume it would have to be mainly the federal government using its fiscal instruments to try to redistribute in racial terms between populations, again, on behalf of mitigating the effects of historical discrimination. I'd be against that, and I can say why.
So I want your thoughts on one, a new language that we have, the language of anti-racism. And a lot of institutions, a lot of individuals are using this language to develop remedies, to think about the problems of race and to think about remedies for it. But of course, anti-racism doesn't always mean opposition to racism. It sort of means, according to some people, a particular thing. And I want to read to you what Ibram X. Kendi says in How to Be an Anti-Racist. A racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. An anti-racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial equity between racial groups. By policy, I mean written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that govern people. There is no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral policy. Every policy in every institution, in every community, in every nation is producing or sustaining either racial inequity or equity between racial groups. I want to add this. The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. What do you think about Kendi's formulation of anti-racism?
I think it's gibberish. It's a cheap shot, okay? He's not here to defend himself. I'd be happy to debate him anytime, anywhere on this point. If I understood the definition, he said.
He doesn't want to debate you. He said he's not interested in you or John.
I can live with that too. If I understood the definition, it is something to the effect of, if I have a racial disparity, anything that you do that exacerbates that disparity is racist. Anything that you do that mitigates that disparity is anti-racist. And since anything you do is either going to exacerbate or mitigate the disparity, any action is either racist or anti-racist, and there's no such thing as a race-neutral action. Well, that's tautological based on the definitions. Okay, so I can't argue, but with the logic given the definitions of what he means by racist and anti-racist. But I just ask you, I mean, I said this in short compass earlier in this conversation. Everywhere I look, I see disparity. I'm not just talking about in the United States of America. I don't know who gets to be an engineer in this country and who doesn't, but I'll bet you anything that some groups are overrepresented and some groups are underrepresented amongst the people who get degrees in engineering. I think I know who gets to play in the National Basketball Association because the Celtics are killing it. My team, the Celtics, we're going to the NBA Finals this year, and we got some white players. You see what I'm getting at? I mean, who's doing brain surgery in this country? Who's trading bonds in this country and doing credit default swaps? Who's teaching our school children? Who's mining coal in this country? I mean, any activity I can think of, there's going to be a profile of participation which is going to diverge in some measure or another from the people's representation in the population. So if every time an African American is underrepresented and getting admitted to the Bronx High School of Science where they give a hard test and you have to do well on a hard test to get in, Caltech, which is right down the road from here somewhere, where they do rocket science, medical school, law school, University of Pennsylvania Law School, Georgetown Law Center Law School, people getting admitted there, et cetera, et cetera. Everywhere I look, I see disparity. So Mr. Kendi will never be able to sleep in his crusade against racism in virtue of the fact that there's never going to be a world, and by the way, this is not just in the United States of America. Everywhere you look on the planet, you see disparities by ethnic, racial, cultural groups within societies of one form or another, whether it be the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Igbo in West Africa, et cetera, you could go on. The Jews, I say it again, because Jews are doing very well, by the way, and by Mr. Kindi's logic, that's an indictment of them. They must be the beneficiaries of pro-Semitic racism if indeed they're overrepresentation amongst this, et cetera, et cetera. I won't belabor the point. We should be a constitutional order of law. People should stand equal before the law. Their standing before the law must not, in our republic, be allowed to become conditioned on their racial identity. I don't care what historical narrative you're enamored of. The neutrality of the law is a bedrock of our civilization. So he plays with fire. He plays with fire if he thinks that a jury's deliberation is racist or anti-racist, depending upon whether the statistics of felons convicted match up with the latest demographic survey about racial representation in the population. I'm against the ideology to which Mr. Kindi has given voice.
But surely
here.
you do believe that some types of disparities are unfair, right? I mean, you make the case that perhaps in basketball, the racial disparities there make sense and are fair according to you. But there certainly are conditions under which disparities.
No, look, you just changed the script.
Sorry.
We went from every disparity being ipso facto unfair to there existing unfair disparities. No one ever disputed that there existed.
Fair enough. I'm moving past Kindi at this point.
Okay.
You're not going to buy that, but I'm trying to sort of think through then. How should we think about disparities? How do we sort of adjudicate this question about which disparities are just and are okay, and which disparities require some kind of
Well, that's why I
response.
mentioned the rule of law, because we have to ultimately deal with how people are being treated. That should be the grounding of our ethical assessment. Are people being treated fairly? Not did the outcomes match up with some ex ante desiderata of equality. So long as people are being treated fairly, whatever outcome, this is going to be my philosophy, it's not going to be everyone's philosophy. I'm influenced here by Robert Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. I'll acknowledge that to you. It's a procedural account that I'm looking at here, not a substantive pattern of outcome account in Nozick's terms. So long as people are being treated fairly, so long as there's a level playing field for people to be treated fairly. Now you may say, I should finish the sentence, so long as people are being treated fairly, the outcome should not be the standard by which I'm going to indict. Rather, the treatment of persons will be the. Now, you may say that, given background conditions, it's, even if I've got employers or people who are making admissions decisions at colleges or people who are making loans at a bank or whatever, who are following strictly the letter of the law, the general circumstances of society, your mother didn't have the education, your grandfather didn't leave you with a nice little bank account or whatever, means that people don't start on even ground. And I agree with that. And some of those people who don't start on even ground are white people. So that even if I grant the conditioning of a entitlement and procedural-like account of justice to take on board the fact that there are extra personal circumstances that could be judged to be unjust or unfair, I don't get to a theory of racial egalitarianism from there. I get to a theory of social egalitarianism, which would apply with equal force, regardless of the racial identity of the person. In fact, I go so far as to say, you're so busy bending over backwards to indict anti-black racism that you become a racist yourself. A racist in the sense that you're worshiping at this shrine of identity and you're privileging the claims of some people over other people based upon their racial identity. That is not a place that we want to be in this country, in my opinion.
So we're going to open it up to questions in a few minutes, so prepare yourself. But one of my last questions, if not the last question, is a lot of institutions have embraced this approach to race. Why do you think it's become popular at elite institutions? And what do you think we should do about that? And generally, where should we go from here?
Okay. I can't, I mean, you need a cultural historian and, you know, somebody who's read all these books that keeps tab on all of the different developments and various aspects, and, you know, in journalism, in the academy, and you know, the marketplace and commerce and whatnot.
He reads all these books, by the way, so.
To, you know, a Christopher Lasch type figure, or somebody like that, late great Christopher Lasch, you know, so who could then opine on, you know, how it is that we've come to this particular juncture. I gave my gloss on one dimension of it, which is that 21st century lagging status of African Americans cries out for an account, and so on. But I think the institutional response is complicated. I think, why does Nike or whatever do what they do? Okay, so they're a company, they got a market, they got a brand, they have to worry about what they do. Why does Brown University does what it does? Well, it's a particular institution with a particular kind of history, and I only single out Brown because that's where I am, but it stands in for a lot of places, including perhaps this place. The elite institutions of higher education who have a certain logic within their own administrative development. They have various stakeholders and constituencies, and they are managing the problem the way that they are managing it. You know, I think there's a certain appeal, is there not, to the music of anti-racism and to the music of white privilege and all of that. Frankly, I have deep issues with it as a way of talking about the conditions of African Americans. I think it's patronizing in the extreme. I think it's cheap grace to a certain extent. I mean, affirmative action, for example, an elite university can bend over backwards to get its optics right, to get the 8, 10, 12% or whatever it needs in the incoming class so that everything looks right. That doesn't actually address the underlying fundamentals of human development, the disparities by race of which are reflected in the conventional instruments of assessment when universities decide whom to admit, like test scores and so forth. And so using lower cutoff scores for your African Americans and fudging that and talking about, well, you know, we're holistic assessment and whatnot, is fine for an institution because the institution is managing its brand and it's trying to keep its image up, and it wants to have a nice little composition of student body for its campus. But there's a collective action problem here, in that, you know, each individual institution may be doing what's good for itself, but the net effect of that may be to avoid addressing the root causes of the disparity in the test scores, which are what necessitates the use of the affirmative action admissions policy, which root causes may have to do with K through 12 educational failure, and may go back to issues of family organization and parenting and things of this kind. Again, you're not supposed to talk about the behavioral and cultural foundations of the disparities. This has no place in the universe of an Ibram X. Kendi, for example, any such accountancy which called attention to the root developmental foundations of the human behavior which leads to the disparities that he condemns is verboten. Everything has to be ascribed to some atmospheric, systemic, white, anti-black racism. So, I mean, I think it's a whole lot easier to embrace this outlook. But I think it is ultimately a false god. I think it is not equality. I think, just to talk concretely about higher education admissions as a case, the more general point that I'm making, using different standards of assessment as a compensatory mechanism in the face of differential performance by race will get you representation, but it won't get you equality. It will get you equity in the Kendian sense of the word, but it won't get you equality of standing. It won't get you equality of respect. It will not give you mastery. It will not give you the solid foundation on which your status would stand. Instead, you become a ward. You become a client. Your position is by their leave. It's because they feel sorry for you. It's because they feel guilty about their role in what they take to be their role in your circumstance. That is not equality.
So what should these institutions do?
To be honest with you, I don't much care. That's flippant. What should Harvard do? Harvard's in court right now. The Supreme Court in the fall is going to hear this case with Students for Fair Admissions. These are Asian students suing Harvard University for fair admissions. What should Harvard do? I frankly don't care. I mean, I can give an answer. They should hew to comparable standards of assessment regardless of the race of their students. They should perhaps be prepared to live with not as high a number of African Americans on campus as they're now getting. They can make whatever marginal investments they can make in trying to contribute to the development, but they're not in the K through 12 business. As I said, it's a collective action problem. They should obey the law, and the court's going to tell them what the law is.
Please join me in thanking Glenn Loury for a provocative and thoughtful presentation. Now we'll open it up for questions.
When you come up to the mic, please take a minute to just introduce yourself, name, year, major. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Desmond. I'm a government major in my junior year at Claremont McKenna here. I did want to ask, sort of, you mentioned how disparities may not necessarily come from racism, that there can be other factors. You mentioned that sort of there's verboten sense about behavioral factors. And I wanted to ask you kind of about the work of, for example, Charles Murray, who's made the very incendiary claim that there are, criminality or even intelligence differences across racial lines. Are there other explanations? When we're searching for explanations that aren't racism for disparities, how do we avoid committing racism ourselves, and how do we try to look for the most rigorous explanation we can?
Okay, Charles Murray. And I just actually had a conversation with Sam Harris, the well-known podcaster, in which we touched on Charles Murray. And in fact, Defending Charles Murray is the title of the most recent post at my Substack newsletter. So here goes. So there are differences in measured intelligence on the average between racial groups in the United States. That's just a fact. That's not Charles Murray's opinion. That's just a fact. The controversy, as I understand it, because you can't dispute the fact that when you look at these batteries of tests, and there's a lot of different batteries of tests to look at, you see something on the order of magnitude of a standard deviation difference in the mean performance. And you're seeing this not just on IQ tests, and you're seeing this not just on standardized admissions tests, and you're seeing this on the armed forces qualification tests, and so forth and so on. So you're seeing these differences in measured cognitive ability, or, if you like, achievement between racial groups on the average. What would be the point in denying this very important fact about our society? All the action, it seems to me, is in accounting for what's the root of this and what can be done about it. I'm not an expert in psychometrics or in cognitive psychology or anything like that, so I'm not going to try to pretend to be. I have read Charles Murray's book years and years ago with Richard Herrnstein, The Bell Curve. I'm aware of the arguments that are in that book. I'm aware of some of the studies about heritability that have been done that try to apportion accounting for the differences in individuals in a population of how much of the variance can be explained by inheritance and how much of it can be explained by other factors. But I want to make a different point, which is, and this is why I was willing to publish something in my newsletter at Substack called Defending Charles Murray. He gets to ask the question. We get to argue with him about the answer. So in the case of intelligence differences by race, as I said, I think the descriptive fact is undeniable that there are differences on the average between racial groups in the United States in measured intellectual performance by these tests. That's what you see when you look at the data. Those differences exist. The whys and wherefores of that are the stuff of scientific projects of investigation and disciplines and filling the journals with the articles and so forth. But you get to ask the question. Shutting down the asking of the question, maligning somebody as being, as the Southern Poverty Law Center calls Charles Murray, grossly unfairly, in my opinion, a white supremacist, because he wrote a book inquiring about differences amongst individuals, not mainly amongst racial groups. There's only one chapter in that long book about race in Human Intelligence, maligning him and making it a fit subject for the ostracism of anybody else to investigate. That is gross anti-intellectualism of the worst kind. It terrifies me. What's next? What other questions will we not be able to inquire about next? What other research programs are going to be subverted, uprooted because of political sentiments? Can we inquire about gender? Can we inquire about sexuality? Can we inquire, what is it that we are going to decide a priori in our omniscience that we know the answer to, and therefore a researcher dare not even inquire about it in the first place? So I'm against that kind of censorship, and Murray's a hard case. I grant you that, because it's a live wire, it's a third rail. I grant you, I take no pleasure in saying what I'm saying. But I think, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, we're talking about the foundation of our civilization here. That is, the ability to objectively inquire. You don't like Murray? Find me another scientist. You think he's wrong? Refute him. That shouldn't be that tough if he's that stupid. Shouldn't be that tough to refute him. But the open inquiry into questions about human society, following the data wherever they lead us, is the only way. Anything else is just going into the night.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Simran. I'm a sophomore studying economics and data science at CMC. And my question is, why do you think people are focused so much on pushing college for underserved groups? For example, African Americans, when the graduation rates are very low. I think for the 6-year graduation rate for a 4-year program is only about 40-something% across the U.S. On average, which is obviously very low. And the 4-year rate is, I think definitely is lower than that. And a lot of people are pushing college with these policies like free college, which, incentivize people that really can't afford it to go, and then they just kind of waste time and money, and they don't graduate in a reasonable amount of time, or in many cases at all. So why do you think people are pursuing these, stupid policies? And what do you think people should be doing instead to address disparities in areas such as education?
Okay. I don't know a lot about this, and I'll just state that at the outset. I have a friend, however. His name is Robert Cherry. He's an economist, used to teach at Brooklyn College. He's emeritus now. He's got a book coming out shortly, and one of the themes that he develops in that book is the importance of vocational education, especially for disadvantaged men of color. I mean, it's not only for men, of course, it would be for men and women, but he's especially concerned because he points out that there are very low completion rates. He talks about community colleges. People are being sent to community colleges and the idea that they'll be able to transfer to a 4-year institution. And he basically says that's not for everybody. And in a couple of years, you could get some pretty useful skills that would be marketable in industry and would allow a person to get a decent employment and whatnot. So I am friendly in my own mind toward the idea that we should put more emphasis on directing people toward development programs. These are educational programs that are focused on teaching marketable skills that can, in a year or two, perhaps with an internship with an industry or get some practical experience and whatnot, place a young person in a position of being able to make, you know, $40 or $50 an hour instead of $15 an hour, doing something that society really values.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor Loury. My name is Henry Long. I'm a first-year student here at Claremont McKenna College. You made a distinction between unfair outcomes and unfair treatment. Is there a possibility or a likelihood that unfair outcomes can lead to unfair treatment through means such as stereotyping?
Would you say a little bit more, can you give me an example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, of course. So consider someone who's a rational person who looks at the data and says, well, black people have higher crime rates, so therefore they're more likely to commit crimes, or I don't want to hire black people for that reason, even though that's a true claim.
Okay, so that's unfair outcomes leading to unfair treatment. The treatment being the discrimination based on the stereotype. The outcome being the foundation for the stereotype.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm asked, in effect, what do I think about the legitimacy of stereotyping? Like a police officer who behaves differently, so he pulls someone over, the person reaches for the glove compartment without a by your leave, and the officer has to decide in an instant whether or not to shoot or whatever, and might, if it's a young black man, be more fearful because he thinks statistically the odds are higher that that's actually a gun in the glove compartment. If it is an older, gray-haired white lady, he doesn't give it a second thought. He says, ma'am, put your hands on the wheel. He doesn't reach for his pistol at all. And that's definitely differential treatment. And it's presumably based upon experience or word of mouth from experience about differential outcomes. Well, those black kids, you know, they tend to be pretty dangerous in this neighborhood. So a couple of things I think of offhand. One is that kind of behavior is going to be very difficult to completely control because we're all, to some degree, subject to that kind of influence in our daily lives in society. I mean, we feel fear or not based in part upon how we read a circumstance, and the reading of that circumstance is going to turn, no matter how hard we try, it's going to turn to some degree on the demography and so forth of the people that we're encountering. If a group of people walking toward me on the dark street late at night, I mean, if they're older or younger, if they're white or they're black, if they're male or they're female, if they're well-dressed or poorly dressed, if they're quiet or they're raucous, I encounter them, I react to them differently depending upon those parameters, and that's called common sense and social cognition. Undoubtedly, we have evolved a ability to discern and react to circumstances that may be threatening to us in part based upon such factors. So I think it will be very, very difficult to extirpate that kind of discrimination. I haven't addressed the question of the moral status of that kind of behavior. I'm speaking right now about the inevitability of human beings to behave to some degree in that way. I talk about this in my book, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality, where I have a whole chapter on racial stereotypes. That's one thing. Now, institutionally, being aware of this kind of stereotyping temptation, I can try to train, I don't know, a police officer or develop an administrative process that guards against that inclination having too detrimental an impact upon individuals. I can think about, in the analogy with the police officer, about various protocols and rules of engagement that might, at some risk to the officer, limit the officer's ability to legitimately act upon his or her instincts. And I might try to do something about that. I might try to, in a personnel evaluation context, where I've got men and women, and where there may be some stereotyping of females in that environment detrimental to women that enter into job assessments, I can do various regulations of the assessment process that are aimed at being aware of that and trying to root that out. But the moral status of those behaviors is I think, actually an interesting, the moral status of stereotyping behavior is, I think, an interesting problem. Because it can't be right to say that any judgment rendered based upon the average of a population, which may be right or wrong with respect to any particular individual, but which is accurate for the average, any such judgment then being acted on is morally wrong. That can't be right. Can't be right because, well, here's some things that are like that. Credit scores, where a lender looks at the credit history of a borrower and decides to make the loan or not based on the credit score. Well, the credit score is a kind of stereotype. An individual's score might be low, but that doesn't mean that that individual is a deadbeat. It could be for various random factors that occur to that individual, and it may not be an accurate assessment of that individual's willingness to pay. An insurance underwriter who decides on a premium when assessing a risk and what the insurance company has to charge will use stereotyping, which is categorical judgments based on statistical averages in order to come to a judgment about whether or not to charge this premium or that premium, or whether or not to write the policy at all. And it can't be that that's immoral. Again, we could have exceptions to I think, what should be a relatively open acceptance of the value of statistical generalization in making judgments of this kind. We could have exceptions. So for example, women tend to live longer than men do. So you might want to price life insurance for men and women differently based on actuarial tables, and then someone might come along and say, well, no, actually, you don't want to price life insurance. In that case, men should pay more for life insurance, right? Because they're more likely to die and the company has to pay out. But they should pay less for annuities because they're not likely to live long enough to collect on the annuity. And then someone might come along and say, well, no, I don't want gender bias in the pricing of insurance contracts, or at least not the annuities where the women would be at a disadvantage, et cetera. And then we might be willing to forego the efficiency benefits of using the information because we think that the equity cost of the disparate treatment by, in this case, gender category is too great to bear. Anyway, I go on at length and people are leaving the line and I don't blame you. So I'll stop. That was a little bit off. The energy's going out of the room. We got to move on to the next question.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for speaking with us. My name is Melanie Kalla. I'm a first year at CMC, and I'm studying government and history. Before I get to my question, there's a limited time for Q&As. They're not leaving because they don't want to ask one. They're leaving because there's not enough time left. Just wanted you to know that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I wasn't offended.
All right. Given your statement that policy targeting one race is racist and unnecessary if everyone is treated equally in the eyes of the law, what is your response to the argument that indirect reparations are essential because the money they would put into the institutions and resources of Black communities would build them to a level of success that would exist if it were not for the loss of foundational wealth, specifically Black people experienced, whether you're talking about that's from slavery or events like the Tulsa Race Massacre?
Indirect reparations, you say. So that's like, say, support for historically Black colleges and universities?
You could talk about that, or if you're looking at majority Black communities themselves, building up those schools, so not just the college level, of elementary schools, preschool programs, middle school, healthcare resources, community centers as well, and not just having those exist in the first place, but ensuring the quality of those.
I wouldn't do it by race, but that's just me. I mean, I feel like I'm kind of tilting at a windmill here to hold out this idea of transracial humanism. I want need to be the driving force. I want a decent society for everybody, not just for black people. And I've got a number of different arguments for that. One of them is, if you really want progressive politics in this country, you got to get majorities. And to get majorities, you need white people and others to be with you. And if your program is worth defending and you can get a majority of the population behind it, then that's a win. That's a win for justice. So there's a kind of pragmatic argument, but there's also a principled argument here. I don't think the speculative historical causation argument, racism existed in America and still exists to some extent, but existed viciously so through slavery, through Jim Crow, and so forth and so on. And therefore, black disadvantage today being to some degree a fruit of that despicable historical racism warrants special attention from us. I don't really think so, and I know that I may not be, I may not have a lot of company on my side. I think we need to get beyond that. I think we need to look forward, not backwards, and I think we need to deal with the problems for all of our people. I think that's both politically a more feasible program, and at the end of the day, I think it's an ethically more justifiable program.
Thank you.
Okay, I know I'm repeating myself, and and it's only what I think. It's not, my mouth is not a prayer book up here. But believe me, I'm not alone in thinking this.
Hi, I'm Sydney. I'm a senior at CMC. Assuming you agree that race is a social construct, do you believe it's a necessary one? And if so, why? And if not, how do we sort of abolish race?
Thank you for that question. So I have a friend, his name is Thomas Chatterton Williams.
So she's in my class that we read.
Have you read Unlearning Race?
So we read the,
what does he call it? Portrait in Black and White, Unlearning Race. You read Losing My Cool?
no, we read Portrait, I'm sorry. Portrait.
Okay. Anyway, yeah, I was going to say some people are beginning to think about what comes after race. I do think that race is a social construct, a necessary one. Well, it's the foundation of my identity. I'm a black guy from the south side of Chicago in my 8th decade of life, have been black all of my life, wake up in the morning being black, go to bed at night being black, proudly married to a black woman from Houston, wouldn't have it any other way. My kids are black. But I was born in 1948. The last time I checked is 2022. And when the arrow points forward, it's a new world. Interracial marriage is up, biracial kids are up, identity is fluid. Why would we lock ourselves into the 19th century? So I don't know how this happens, but I think we have to allow freedom for people to explore the fullness of our humanity. I mean, I'm black, but I'm not only black. My kids are black, but they're not only black. And whether I wear this thing as a heavy, coat, or I wear it so that I can relax and let it hang low and take it off sometimes, that is my racial identity. That is the baggage of my racial identity. I was at the dinner table tonight, we were talking about this, and I was saying, the phrase, you can't go home again? It's a literary phrase. Somebody must have come up with it at some point. No, you can't go home again. It's a good thing you can't go home again. We don't need to go home to what was. We need to look ahead, I think, to what might be. And I think the idea of locking in to race as it had been is a very reactionary idea.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I'm Steve, I'm a sophomore here. So you mentioned that you endorse Nozick's procedural justice, and also you mentioned you would endorse leveling the playing ground. I'm just curious how you would reconcile the two, and why don't you endorse like Ross allocated procedural justice instead? I'm not talking about like those like anti-racist policies, but just like it can be as simple as taxation or other forms of like allocative policy.
I couldn't quite hear the question. Maybe Michael could.
Oh, okay, sorry. So you mentioned how you would endorse Nozick's procedural justice. You also mentioned how you would endorse like leveling the playing field for people, especially in like capitalist marketplace.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you would reconcile the two.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you. How do I reconcile, on the one hand, a procedural and entitlement account of justice in which I want the rules to be clear and be equally applied to everybody, with a commitment to a kind of social support system that doesn't leave anybody behind, that kind of idea. So I'm not personally, again, this is just me, I'm not a libertarian, I'm not a minimal state, night watchman state. Let the state exist only to make sure that nobody comes and steals my property and no one attacks me, but other than that, get out of the way state. I would say that the possibilities of social insurance and social cooperation in the modern industrial world where, you know, what are we going to do about homelessness? What are we going to do about kids that don't have enough to eat? What are we going to do about single moms who don't have enough to be able to keep a roof over their kids' head and so forth? What are we going to do about people who can't afford health care in a world in which health care becomes very expensive? What do we do to help secure people who might suffer unemployment during a business cycle up and down and so on? Where we have enough to where we can help to take care of some of our people, and then it becomes a question of how much. So it's going to sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth a little bit here, because there are purists, and I know some of them, who will say once you get on that slippery slope of a little bit of welfare state, you end up with the squad writing laws in the U.S. Congress that is taking wealth away from, you know, the rich people and whatever. But I think you can look to the very successful, stable, capitalist social democracies of Northern Europe, which are different in their demographic makeup and in their social histories. And you can see examples of societies that are both prosperous, free, and decent in the sense of having a pretty robust safety net for everybody. So pragmatic judgment about the benefits, but also the cost of social provision that trades that off in a sensible way is, I think, consistent with my view of the world.
Thank you.
Please,
All right.
please join me in thanking Professor Loury for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Okay, Michael, thanks for your
And also thank you to
friendly
Professor
jousting.
Fortner for moderating discussion. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a great Tuesday night.